Humanity is an ambitious species, always looking to push the boundaries in terms of science and technology. In an attempt to define the limits of this ambition, many forms of media, from books to films to art to video games, have tried to explore this concept, theorizing and predicting the paths we might take as a species as we forge into the future. Often these futures are not utopian, with most writers seeing human nature as a corrupting force that will inevitably lead to a dark future. Black Mirror is an entire show dedicated to exploring this idea, that technology can be a tool for widespread good, yet human greed and selfishness will ultimately lead to it being misused to humanity's detriment. In terms of games, we have the likes of Soma, which does indeed show a mix of the good and bad of humanity, and its relationship to technology, and rather than it focusing on the negative traits of humanity, it shows us a dark future through which technology is used to preserve humanity in a form which no doubt leads us to have some existential dread. While these stories may differ in execution, concept and message, they are all stories that explore humanity's relationship to technology to paint a future that may horrify and disturb us. What if there was a future where humanity's technology took a drastically different turn, where resources became so scarce that humanity invested into a very different type of technology, biomechanics? A world where machinery is made of flesh, where humanity and their technology are interconnected and almost indistinguishable. A world where our planet is barren of every resource except our own flesh, and as such it is used for everything: food, building materials, fuel, and technology. This is the premise of Scorn, a 2022 horror experience that presents the most grim depiction of humanity's future that I have ever seen. In this game, we wander the empty halls of a fallen civilization, of a human society who built their future upon flesh, a society so alien to what we experience in our modern world that it lingers in the mind long after you have reached its disturbing conclusion. Throw in some stomach-churning body horror and ideas around human consciousness, and you have a recipe for a truly unforgettable experience. Not a single word of dialogue is spoken in this game, making it a lonely and isolating experience, as you feel like the last living person in the universe. Yet despite the absence of any exposition, there is a fascinating story to be found here, both in terms of the background lore, as well as the main journey that our protagonist experiences throughout the game's 5 acts. In this lore video, we will be unpacking every detail we can from this haunting game. Using the environmental details and information from the art book, we will dive deep and explain the story of Scorn. So grab a drink of red goop and your piston gun, and let's get to work. But if you enjoy a good lore video, then consider subscribing to the channel and joining my Patreon for some additional benefits. Thank you so much. Now let us begin. It can sometimes sound pretentious to refer to games as a work of art, but I think that in Scorn's case it is very much evident that this term is applicable. In the art book, we learn that the developers very much started from their 2 clearest inspirations, and directly built a game and world based on a combination of these works. These 2 artists are none other than H.R. Giger and Beksinski, and even from these few images, I think it is clear to see the influence these artists had on the aesthetic design of the game. In this video, I will lean quite heavily on a particular resource, the art book for the game. This book is excellent and is absolutely packed with insights from the development team, where they directly discuss the lore and inspiration behind the game. Art books are always a great resource for games, but I would say it is even more the case for Scorn, which is a game that leans extremely heavily on its aesthetic and artistic vision. This is not to mention the direct lore answers we get in the book, for a game that does not have a single direct piece of dialogue in game. If you are a big fan of this game as I am, I would highly recommend the art book. It is definitely one of the better ones, and is packed with incredible art and information from the game devs. With that said, let us discuss and unpack the relevance of the two main artists who inspired the aesthetic and themes of this game. H.R. Giger is best known for his work on the xenomorph for the Alien series, but his body of works expand far beyond this, and Scorn very heavily draws upon his expanded body of work, making an entire world, in fact, that adheres to his aesthetic. His work is clearly biomechanical, a blend of flesh and machine that makes one feel uncomfortable, and I think that is one of the things I always enjoyed about the xenomorph in the Alien films. The creature was very bestial, a predator, and yet there was clearly something mechanical about it, hinting at an interesting origin story. This blend of flesh and machinery is unnatural, and as a result it conjures revulsion in us. It certainly says something about Scorn's world that every corridor is a reminder of that unsettling concept. There is more to this, however, and it is an element that Scorn certainly explores, and that is the fact that Giger's transposition of flesh onto landscapes is meant to highlight man's negative impact on our environment via industrialization that poisons the natural world. To quote the man himself, "A sick landscape marks men, and my landscapes are nothing more than the transplanting of human skin onto our surroundings." Scorn's world is dystopian, a future human society where we have completely obliterated every natural resource available on our planet. In this world, humanity has been forced to cannibalize his own flesh, as the only resource remaining. Thus, the world surrounding us is both a nod to this metaphorical idea of Giger's, but also a literal interpretation of it, where humanity has destroyed the natural world, and thus their taint is all that remains. What I really like about Scorn is that it takes H.R. Giger's art and tries to apply it to an entire civilization, blending it into every wall, every contraption, and every mural. Giger's pieces were one-off murals, shocking us with a glimpse into a biomechanical future. Scorn is the realization of that vision in complete and 3D form. There is another unsettling element to Giger's art that also makes it into Scorn, and that is the phallic element, blending suggestive depictions with his surrealist style that again are meant to make us feel revulsion. This is certainly one of the more obvious elements to see within the game's art, with many of the machines and pistons taking on suggestive forms and movements, never mind the overt depictions of copulation that are prevalent in the polis segment of the game. The phallic shape of the xenomorph itself, and its violent way in which it impregnates its victims, is of course a live-action exploration of his ideas, and thus we must conclude that his reason for these elements in his art is to explore the intersection of violence and reproduction. In regards to Scorn, the game director explains the inclusion of such depictions as an exploration of the overlap between death and reproduction, death and life, hence why the figures displayed in such amorous depictions are also shown in various stages of decomposition. As we will discuss later, there is an in-game lore reason as to why the humanoids of this civilization are fascinated with copulation, but for now at least, we have an understanding of the artistic reasons for its inclusion. The second artist who was an inspiration for the game was Beksinski, a Polish artist who had a distinct style that is referred to as dystopian surrealism. In my opinion, Giger's works have inspired the micro-design of the game, the interiors, the morals and makeup of this society, whereas Beksinski's captures the macro elements of the game, the greater picture of a dystopian society in decline, the scenes of this planet, which is now a barren wasteland, reduced to such by humanity's destructive presence. Thankfully, you do not need to solely rely upon my amateur art analysis, for the art book reads the following. The way he depicted his worlds was never meant to be realistic, Akovich continues, but it conveys decay really well and it's extremely expressive. Everything merges together, forms become indistinguishable, cracked, hollow, and slowly rotting away in an almost spider web-like pattern. His vision helped us achieve the look and feel we were aiming for. In our own world, organic decaying processes see muscular matter first stiffen after death, then relax and, eventually, liquefy. In Beksinski's worlds, these final two steps don't happen. Liquids coagulate and then calcify, while toughened, atrophied matter doesn't dissolve, but instead peels and flakes away. Nightmarish visions of dried world husks dominate his work, and it's clear to see the artistic through-line from his paintings to Scorn's universe. I think the latter point is especially easy to see in Scorn's design. The husks of the buildings that we see dry up, peel and flake away. A unique take on the entropy of a civilization, which I think meshes really well with the organic nature of these structures. They aren't just buildings which are crumbling, they are organic material that is suffering decay as their systems have long failed or gone silent. Scorn's civilization is a body of flesh and blood, and your journey through it is its final breath of life, before it goes silent forever. There is another element that is present in the design language of the game that is inspired by Beksinski's art, I believe, albeit it is more subtle. It is the feeling of despair or hopelessness that his pieces inspire, best encapsulated by the very image used for this video's thumbnail. You can collect this piece as a card on Steam, with the card being aptly named Vulnerability, and another named Despair. The helplessness of Beksinski's pieces is well captured by Scorn's environment and game design, as you make your lonely journey through a long dead and grotesque civilization. So taking this all together, what do we have? Firstly, I would say that Scorn builds quite clearly from these artistic inspirations, but the developers have still built their own unique world and civilization that has a fascinating lore in its own right. However, understanding the meaning of these inspirations can tell us the intent on the developer's part, and what themes their story aimed to explore. In that regard, I think we can expect a story that explores humanity's decline and their destructive impact upon the Earth. I will conclude this video that the main themes of this game are loss of humanity and isolation, and I'm sure that anyone playing the game will instinctively feel this, even without an in-depth analysis. With that said, let us use this new understanding of the game's inspiration. Let us get into the nitty-gritty of this game's world. I think one of the first things that came to my mind when playing this game is how alien this civilization feels, to the point that I initially assumed that this was an alien race, a human-like civilization but not meant to literally be us. However, upon examining the very detailed art book, we can see the intent is that this is meant to be a dark interpretation of our future. The art book quotes game director Lubomir Peklar's explanation of the setting, and I quote the book now. In the years since Scorn was first unveiled, many people have suggested its world is alien. It's not, confirms Peklar. It's an extrapolation of our world, we just push it to the limits. When you understand that this story is meant to represent a dark possible future, the horror and revulsion to what we see becomes even stronger. These beings are meant to be our descendants, so far removed from what we originally were, rendered grotesque by human experimentation and technology. The horror comes from blending the familiar with the grotesque, the vaguely human forms of the protagonist and his race, the constructions we can recognize as buildings, yet built with a material that naturally revolts and disturbs us. We see flesh used in ways that we could not envisage in our contemporary world. Pipes and mechanisms that usually would be constructed with metal or plastics are fleshy, part organ, part construct. Flesh is the primary resource of this civilization. It is grown, it is shaped, it is eaten, it is a building material, and a food. I think the reason this human society has resorted to flesh as a resource is cleverly hinted at by the environmental details given in the game. In a few instances, we actually get to view the planet's surface, and it paints a very bleak picture. The entire surface seems to be a blasted wasteland, engulfed by never-ending storms. To me, it is meant to represent a future Earth, where humanity has completely stripped the entire planet of all natural resources. With every resource mined, humanity turned to the only viable left available to them, their own flesh, and biomechanics became the focus of development moving forward. Inevitably, this blend of biology and technology would affect humanity themselves, which is why we see the form of the humanoids in Scorn to be quite distinctly different from our own. Indeed, the reproductive cycle of humanity has also become part of the biomechanical technology that permeates their civilization. The first location we visit, the assembly, is actually quite useful in giving us an insight into the flesh economy. Again, the art book provides us some useful information as to the function of this facility, as it says the following of the assembly level. Ostensibly, it's a recycling plant. A noble cause, you might think, until you discover what is being recycled. The whole level is designed around the idea that we use everything in our environment as a resource, even living things, says game designer Lubomir Peklar. And once you set it up in that way, a factory for using or reusing living things, we needed to figure out how it functions. That's how these designs happened. As I stated earlier, flesh is essentially the primary resource for this civilization. Thus it makes sense that it is recycled and reused at every opportunity. That is what this factory is, a recycling plant that produces these wretched creatures. The mold men. The art book refers to these beings as sausage meat, that they are the hens in the assembly's battery farm, pressed into their shells like vacuum-packed products. Except these products are still alive. It is clear from the factory's processes that these beings are broken down and stripped for parts, likely as food and other materials. One thing that I think is useful to note at the onset of the video is that in the art book, the game director admits that in a lot of cases the aesthetic of a location took priority over explaining everything. That being said, I do find that a lot of the machinery we find can make sense, and there is no reason for us not to speculate on what we can see. Returning to the mold men, they are living beings, and yet hardly considered as such. Piles of discarded moldmen lie scattered around the factory, showing how disposable they were truly considered to be. When we reach the final location, Polis, we will see another example of artificially created life in the form of the homunculi, which are a fairly sophisticated creation that we will discuss later. However, the moldmen are much more crudely made, and again the art book gives us an insight into the exact process of how recycled meat was able to create these life forms. It reads the following. This act of processing is an excruciating, inhumane procedure that first involves pressing the body, which takes time, says concept artist Filip Akovich, then moulding it into a package, and then leaving the contorted, crumpled remains to dry out into usable nuggets. These moldmen are literally piles of meat pressed into molds, and then given life. There was a point in going into a fairly long tangent about the mold men. Mainly, it is the easiest and clearest illustration of this civilization's command over life and their flesh economy. For if they can build these rudimentary forms of life as a material, are they capable of creating beings that are more complex? The answer is, of course, yes, and it seems as though humanity itself now exists in this same flesh economy, with growth pods replacing the womb. We can find these pods all throughout our journey, yet it is at the more ornamental polis where we see the symbolic significance of these pods, as they are connected to a fluid injector that is shaped as a pregnant woman. The implication is clear. Humanity is no longer bred in the traditional sense. They are grown, designed, and as such, this explains the massive differences between a contemporary human and the humanoids we see in the world of Scorn. These humanoids are artificially crafted, leading to a uniformity of form, as they become yet another mass-produced product. What is interesting to me is that there seems to be two ways in which the mainline humanoids are produced: these pods and the Wall of Genesis. At the start of Act 2, when we take up the mantle of the main protagonist, we see our full birthing process from his POV. Like a traditional birth, we have an umbilical cord, but any other hangovers from classical births end there. We emerge fully formed from a pod in the wall, and looking up at this vast, endless structure, we can see other pods, from some even dangle corpses still attached to their cords. At the base of the wall we find no small number of bodies, highlighting the fact that this is a messy, imperfect process, with many births failing as soon as they began. The random nature of how humans are grown from this wall is well shown by the concept art found in the art book. It seems as though new humanoids grow or form from the flesh that lies beneath the hard surface of the wall, an amalgam of organs coming together and growing out of the wall. From the images, it seems as though the entire wall is organic matter that slowly coalesces into a human. A hard cyst forms around this emerging humanoid, and we can see these at random points all over the wall. The art book says the following of this fascinating construction: built not with bricks and mortar but from flesh, organs and uterine lining, here stands the answer to the question of where Scorn's protagonist originates. The universe's humanoid creations are neither born from a creature or assembled in a lab, but birthed from ruptures on the side of an unnatural embankment the team refers to as the Genesis Wall. The main character's genesis expressed visually, says game director Lubomir Peklar. There is nothing more to it than that. How did it come into being? Why is it this way? That we are not explaining, he teases. Early we spoke of how H.R. Giger's works sometimes highlight the connection between violence and reproduction, the overlap of death and birth. Well, no clearer illustration could there be than the bloody and visceral birth of the protagonist in Scorn. As you can see from the words of the game director, they are being rather coy as to the origins of this wall, and this is in line with their mantra that we viewed earlier, where they mention they don't necessarily need to explain how and why everything works the way it does. However, I think what we can say is that this is a technology, or construction of this civilization, meant to help keep a dying civilization alive through asexual reproduction. I do wonder what the relationship between the wall and these pods are. Perhaps they are just two different ways of creating humanoids. Perhaps the lower drone class are born from the wall, and the upper Polis class were created in the pods. There's a slightly different look to our player character on the ones found in the pods, perhaps suggesting two different classes of humanoids. Another alternate possibility is that this was once a two-stage process, which has since fallen apart due to the collapse of this society, meaning that they were once born from the wall, but then refined by this secondary process. Indeed, we see other examples of how the flesh product can be refined through various stages in order to create a superior product. We can look no further than the red fluid that feeds into the aforementioned pod machines. We also later use this fluid to fill the armoured shells at Polis, a fluid that fills them with life and opens their third eye, and thus allowing us to mind transfer to this vessel. This refined product is made from crushed homunculi, which themselves are of course a man-made product. While they are more sophisticated than the moldmen, they too are created to be used as a resource. The art book says the following of these creatures: continuing Scorn's themes of treating every life form as a potential resource, these creatures are artificially created homunculi, born out of experimentation, to seek a different kind of living substance for consumption. They are made of a hallucinogenic matter that people use to reach higher states of consciousness. This is why the fluid of theirs can be used to create a telekinetic connection between the armoured shells and the ascended humans. They are specifically crafted for their hallucinogenic qualities. Homunculi as a concept in the real world is an alchemical one, in which they are theoretical artificially created miniature humans. So again, this is another flesh product of the civilization, another form of humanity, but obviously a far more refined variant than the likes of the Moldmen. In the art book we learn of some cut content that would have further developed the story and depth of the homunculi. The homunculi were meant to be intelligent engineers of this society, and in an area called the Blasted Labyrinth, we would have witnessed two factions of the homunculi battling for supremacy. a conflict born from an ambition to take over Polis itself. All of that to say that these creatures are intelligent, and clearly quite an advanced product, and thus the fluid we get from crushing them could be seen as refined life stuff. Returning to the Wall of Genesis, the protagonist is clearly born from this wall, but it is heavily implied that the Parasite is also born from this construction. In Act 1, we play a different character, a humanoid who after an accident will become the Parasite antagonist. However, prior to this, he plays and looks exactly the same as the Act 2 onwards protagonist. Just to clarify this for those who haven't played the game, in Act 1 you play a character who ends up transforming into a parasite. Then in Act 2 onwards you play a new character who becomes the protagonist moving forward. I will refer to both of these characters as the parasite and the protagonist respectively. In the opening moments of the game we get two overlapping POVs, meant to mirror different points in the parasite's journey, and it can be quite confusing as to what is happening here, at least until you have played through the game once. But to explain what is happening here, you are seeing two moments in the parasite's journey. The part outside is the true beginning. This is him walking across the planet's surface after being born from the Wall of Genesis, much as the protagonist will in Act 2. The darker scene where he is crawling along the floor is a moment following the events of Act 1's ending, where the player is consumed by a white fluid. After some time, the player pulls themselves from the crust and they have been drastically transformed, becoming the creature known as the Parasite. In Act 2, which I postulate is many years later, our new protagonist comes into contact with the Parasite and they are bonded. The protagonist is only able to advance because of his relationship to the Parasite, as the latter has the piston tool attached to him. Without this tool and the ability to use its hilt for guns, the protagonist wouldn't have made it very far, and yet its presence is a ticking time bomb. As the closer we get to our target, the more its influence spreads throughout our body, eventually leading us to a disturbing conclusion. I think at this point I would like to give a surface level overview of the main story plot, as I have mainly been talking about thematics and the deeper lore, and I appreciate those that are new to the game may have trouble following. Act 1 begins with you waking up in the shoes of a humanoid, who walks across the planet's surface and falls into a factory called the Assembly. To progress, this humanoid tries to reactivate certain machinery that bars his progression. However, he eventually meets with an industrial accident, and he is consumed by a white fluid that transforms him into a new creature known as the Parasite. Act 2 begins, and a new protagonist is born from the Genesis Wall, and it is this character we will play as for the rest of the game. The new protagonist also travels to the Assembly, but we learn that a long time has passed, and in that time, the Parasite has evolved and become bestial. The Parasite assails our protagonist and they become a symbiotic duo, with the protagonist gaining access to the piston gun tool that has become part of the Parasite's body. Together they travel from the Assembly to the facility known as the Crater, and from here they will access a massive lift that takes them to a train station, a station which leads to Polis, our final destination. However, while the Assembly was full of mechanical dangers, the Crater is full of biological ones, for in the depths of the crater lies the Queen, and from her is born her fleshy brood. So let's talk about that. When we leave the Assembly floor, we enter the outer reaches of the crater, seemingly an extension of the factory, but one that ultimately culminates in a large pit, with an elevator at the centre. An elevator that leads to the train station that will take us to Polis. We can actually see this large facility on the surface, with the elevator terminus looming large over the horizon as we pass by. I think this is a really nice touch by the developers, to make sure the surface skybox matches with the path we take in the indoor locations. There's a problem, however, which becomes readily apparent when we enter this location for the first time in Act 3. It is utterly overwhelmed with flesh growths. Even the elevators you need to access are completely choked out by this material, and so you will spend most of this act freeing said elevators. These growths are highly disturbing, as you will eventually notice that some of these growths can detach, acting as an aggressive individual unit that you will need to kill. The truth of these growths is not revealed until we reach the crater, and come face to face with the titanic Crater Queen, from which all of these growths originate. The art book says the following on this monstrosity. It all begins with the nameless form we'll call the Crater Queen, a hunched monstrosity composed of sinewy strands and tumors. She's the mother of all other creatures across these pages. Wallowing in a darkened lair at the bottom of the crater location, her job is to hemorrhage an endless surge of descendants. These beings have a shared DNA, which is why they are all ultimately connected, and while they take different forms, they are all the same in material being pumped out from a similar source. But the question becomes, what is the Crater Queen? Where does it come from? Well, I do think that this creature design and its brood are a great demonstration of what could possibly go wrong using this type of technology. As humans made of flesh, we are subject to disease, genetic aberrations, and other maladies. So wouldn't flesh used for construction or technology be susceptible to the same types of issues? I believe so, and I think this is what we are seeing here. Likewise, we can see other cancerous growths coming from Genesis Wall, showing that this is a common problem and the crater isn't an isolated event. We will discuss in the coming chapters that I believe the actions of the upper classes of Polis essentially resulted in them leaving the rest of the civilization to die outside their walls. I believe with a lack of leadership and failing birthing processes, the civilization began to die out. With that, the flesh would not be properly maintained, and it was only a matter of time until a problem emerged. Given the humanoids are able to create sentient beings, like the mold men, it is very possible that the Crater Queen is simply a product like these that has grown out of control or mutated. It is also equally likely that she is simply a cancerous growth that has spawned from one of the many flesh constructions that litter this civilization. A cancer in the body that is this building, fitting given every house, factory, or palace in this civilization is seemingly organic. This entire segment is perhaps the most harrowing of the entire game, as we brute force our way through these endless organic forms, much as a white blood cell might try in vain to curb the growth of an aggressive tumour. Thankfully, our time with the Queen is ended when we activate the elevator that lies beneath her body. As we are brought skyward and away from her brood, so too is she violently excised from the body. Perhaps this is a successful operation, with the tumour removed. Perhaps her spread will die, or perhaps it will continue to grow in her absence. Either way, we put it out of our mind as we leave the visceral scene behind us, and travel by train to the clean halls of Polis. Polis is a location that is dripping with environmental storytelling, that tells us so much about the civilization and their ultimate beliefs. When we first enter this building, we are presented with a rather disconcerting scene. The place is far cleaner than the prior locations we have visited, closer to a temple than the industrial locations like the crater and the assembly. Yet the cleanliness of this location is harshly contrasted by the splayed humans, crucified and with their brain matter connecting together in a collective nexus. These are the Ascended, humans who have left humanity and their civilization behind. We learn the following of Polis from the art book, which states, "The Citadel is a lone peninsula in a sea of fog, with access controlled via narrow bridges. No entity can enter or leave without scrutiny, ensuring the Ascended populace remains protected and unspoiled." Polis is the temple of aspiration for this civilization, and it is where our protagonist ultimately heads as well. All paths lead to Polis and to ascension. Flesh has become devalued within this society, and so it is the human consciousness which is prized and protected. We discussed earlier how new humanoids are now mainly produced through an artificial process, symbolically replacing pregnancy, hence the imagery of pregnant women we get associated with machinery involved in the birthing process. However, that is not to say that traditional reproduction does not still take place, quite the contrary. Indeed, while our character may initially seem sexless, we can see that he has the tools for the job, so to speak, near the end of the game. We also see that Polis is decorated with highly suggestive pieces of art that depict intercourse quite brazenly. Yet it is not celebrated as part of the reproductive cycle, rather it is celebrated as an act of consciousness. We once again learn this from the art book, which states the following: "Sexual gratification fascinates the civilization, for it represents one of the most heightened levels of consciousness attainable within humanoid bodies. It all plays into the greater ideology of the Ascended and the purpose of Polis, to ascend one's consciousness beyond the original humanoid form. Indeed, this is the ultimate aim of our protagonist, who almost makes it to true ascension, but is unlucky to be caught by his parasite right at the cusp of transformation. But more on that later. Returning to the idea of enhanced consciousness, we can see that the Ascended, likely the upper classes of this society, have seemingly abandoned their physical form, with their brain matter twisted into a sort of conjoined consciousness, a hive mind of humanity. Our protagonist undergoes this same process during his journey, and we see that his mind is able to transcend his mortal body. He is then able to possess the armoured shells that reside nearby, an ascension of consciousness, which seems to be the ultimate aim of this civilization. This process is referred to in the art book as mind transfer, and the civilization developed a number of automatons known as shells that the Ascended would be able to pilot at will, escaping the confines of a singular body. Indeed, we get further hints of how this process is meant to work from some of the nearby murals found within the city. In one depiction, we see a tentacled creature rising from the mind of a human. Once again, the art book spells out the relevance of this creature. It is the form that the human mind is to evolve into. It reads the following: "That transferal procedure first occurs with people's consciousness escaping the body and manifesting a new physical entity, a nameless creature that looks like brain and spinal column that's grown frilly wings and tentacles. This entity is then free to crawl inside empty hollow shells like a hermit crab seeking a new home, with each shell promising different capabilities. Once a shell has been chosen, the consciousness's next evolutionary step can begin. Fusion happens, and you then have ascended forms which are in these psychedelic colours, lots of purples, pinks, and blues." So a lot of information here, and as you can see from this concept art of the consciousness creature, it is clearly the one depicted in game on this mural, fittingly emerging from a human's mind. They would then enter a shell of their choice, a new body so to speak, and merge with it over time. And this is in general a process which allows humanity to escape their fragile biological forms. The fact we see this creature represented in-game on a mural means it does exist in the in-game universe. However, we do not see one in the flesh, so to speak. However, I think what we witness near the end of the game is a part of that process. Perhaps the beginning of it. The main protagonist's mind is able to leave his body behind, described in the art book as the beginning of this process. He is then able to mind transfer into the two armoured shells that are nearby. However, this seems to be a more immature form of the process described in the art book. There is no physical form to our player character's consciousness. Additionally, there seems to be a biological element to the shells in which he's able to possess. Throughout our time in Polis, we are ultimately working towards activating these shells. We do so by crushing down homunculi into a concentrated red fluid. We could see this fluid as concentrated or refined life, and when injected into these empty shells, it has an effect on them. As we discussed earlier, the art book tells us that the homunculi are developed specifically for their hallucinogenic and mind-altering qualities. With this potent material injected, it may make them a more suitable host for someone learning the ability of mind transfer. Not only are their bellies filled with this product, but a growth burst forth from their forehead. a fleshy growth that results in an eye appearing in their forehead. This is clearly an aesthetic reference to a third eye opening, a motif that is used to express a state of heightened awareness or the emergence of psychic abilities, which is fitting, because it is the emergence of these third eyes that allow our character to mind jump to them. During this sequence, we are able to mind jump freely between either of these new frames, and I want to try and explain how this fits in with the lore described in the art book, as this does seem to be a little different from the brain creature, slotting itself into empty shells. In summary, I believe this to be the early stages of that transformation, the moments when a would-be ascended human learns how to control this power. According to the art book, this new squid-like form manifests once someone's consciousness has escaped from their mortal form, fully and physically. What if this process our protagonist undertakes is the first step in achieving that true ascension, only able to jump between different frames, rather than being able to completely leave a physical form? At the beginning of this process, the protagonist's brain matter is connected to the hive mind of the other ascended, and I imagine it is in this new state of being he learns of mind transfer, drawing on the collective knowledge of the others. Perhaps given time using this power, and repeatedly leaving his body, he would have been able to ascend and become this floating brain life form. However, it seems as though humanity has ascended beyond even that, as something even more strange lies at the back of Polis, beyond the flesh mural. Using his new abilities and the armoured shell, the protagonist carries his old form through the flesh gate into a processional passage. At the end of this passage we see a sight that defies explanation, a large purple miasma, an eldritch form that seems to be the endpoint of this processional passage, which is overlooked by ceremonial statues. This seems to be the object to which the protagonist is drawn as well, so what is this? What is going on here? Well, using the free cam to look a little more closely at the form of this object, I note that it seems to have protrusions that look like brain matter. My belief is that this is what the Ascended have become, a collective consciousness that transcends the physical version we see in the central room of Polis. We know that flesh is seen as inconsequential compared to consciousness for this civilization, and as such, they do whatever they can to separate the two, to ascend as pure consciousness. We have been led to believe that the pinnacle of this pursuit is the brain creature, a reduction of the physical form for sure, but it still is technically physical, a form of flesh and blood. What if the humanoids of this civilization want to move even further away from the physical and become pure consciousness? Having since played Shadow of the Erdtree and seeing the Gate of Divinity at the top of a Near Illim, I could not help but think that this Eldritch Gateway is something similar, that entering it triggers some kind of ascension. This was what our protagonist wanted. However, unfortunately for him, the avatar of flesh caught up with them. You see, when we arrived at Polis, we used some surgical equipment to finally remove the parasite, who was dangerously close to fully consuming the protagonist. However, at the last moment, the protagonist is caught in a weakened position, and is finally consumed by the parasite before he can ascend. But more on that later. In a lot of ways, I certainly see some parallels to Bloodborne's greater themes here. The Great Ones are a central lore point, great beings who have ascended to higher planes of consciousness and thought. The most advanced of these beings, like Erden and Wet Nurse of Murgo, have essentially left their physical forms behind. Additionally, Miyazaki, the game director for Bloodborne, expressed in interviews that one of the main themes he wanted to explore in that game was childbirth. He stated that as species become more advanced, their rate of procreation goes down, and in the case of the Great Ones, they could not have children at all unless they had a surrogate. Again, this feels similar to the human race in Scorn, who have had to resort to asexual and artificial reproduction as they move closer and closer to ascension. There are some final thoughts on this society as a whole I want to discuss. The impression I get is that multiple factors played into the inevitable decline of civilization. Firstly, One of the main issues is one we discussed earlier, that flesh is a flawed product on which to build your economy. It is subject to decay and disease, and I believe the Crater Queen and her spawn are an inevitable symptom of such an economy, a cancer that erodes the systems and structures around her. That being said, these types of ailments will surely have been known to the humanoids of this civilization, and if they were functioning normally, then I'm sure steps would be taken to contain outbreaks like this. This brings me to the second reason I believe the civilization collapsed: the abandonment of the people by the upper classes. I believe this happened as a result of their pursuit of a higher level of consciousness, and that by doing so they essentially let their world of flesh fall to ruin. The reason I have this impression comes from a couple of lines from the art book that says the following of Polis: "The citadel is a lone peninsula in a sea of fog, with access controlled via narrow bridges. No entity can enter or leave without scrutiny, ensuring the ascended populace remains protected and unspoiled." I think the implication here is quite clear. Polis is an island among a crumbling empire, a sealed of sanctuary for the chosen few, who are focusing on ascension, while the rest of society collapses outside of Polis walls. This is a temple for the elite, with controlled traffic in and out, and one thing I find interesting is that at the train station, you can notice there are trains that are loaded with supplies, automated trains, meaning that Polis still took their share of food, created by those they have abandoned to their fate. The elite nature of the complex, I feel, is emphasized by how immaculate it is, compared to the grimy and industrial buildings that characterize most of the civilization. However, Polis is clearly holy, well maintained and purely focused around aspiration and the worship of the human consciousness. Indeed, one of the reasons I find this area so eerie is because of how harshly the visceral brain matter of the Ascended clashes against the pale walls of the building. In short, I believe two main facets contributed to the collapse of this world. The first is the fragility of flesh as a material, and the second is the abandonment of the leadership, who isolated themselves before ascending, leaving their kin to slowly die. In general, it is a fascinating tale of how humanity's destructive nature led us to strip our planet of every resource and ultimately kill it. Faced with a lack of resources, we cannibalized our own flesh, as the only material we could use to sustain us. However, there were those who believed the ultimate solution was to leave the physical behind entirely, eventually devaluing their own flesh after generations of treating it like a cheap material. Yet one of the most interesting things about the game, in my opinion, is that our character is constantly dogged by an avatar of the physical, a manifestation of humanity's biological aspect. And I of course refer to the Parasite, our constant companion and ultimately our demise. I want to talk briefly about the Parasite because we have referenced him throughout, but I haven't yet spoken about him directly, which needs to be rectified now as the Parasite is the antagonist of the game. But he is more than that. He is a reflection of the main protagonist, his shadow if you will. We first of all play as the Parasite after all. Both he and the protagonist follow the same path initially. It's just that the antagonist falls afoul of an industrial accident. The Parasite, in his last act as a humanoid, activates some machinery and is consumed by a white liquid. Again, it is hard to ignore the suggestive nature of the machinery and the white fluid, which acts as a transformative agent, giving birth to a new form of life. The Parasite lies within this fluid for a period of time before breaking out of it, and this is actually what we see on the title screen and in the opening cinematic. Long exposure to this fluid has transformed this creature forever, with the bottom side of the humanoid opening up and flattening out, and its bones becoming spines that cover its body. Most notably, the brain of this being has sort of become its own appendage, attached to the main body via stalk, and it is this part that will attach itself to the protagonist's head. There is another factor regarding this being's transformation that I wish to discuss, and that is time. I believe a large amount of time has passed between the parasite's original transformation and the protagonist being born and entering the assembly. The reason I believe this is because when we start Act 2 and we take command of the new protagonist, we do pass through the factory floor where we played as the parasite in Act 1. We can see that this area is much transformed, with the floor being taken over by a flesh growth. Who knows how many years have passed? How many years in which the mutilated parasite will have lived and skulked in the darkness alone? Perhaps the parasite was still largely human, mentally, when he first awoke from his accident, but upon realizing his new twisted form, I can't imagine any person would have remained sane long. However, after how many years, perhaps hundreds, he has mentally degraded, becoming the bestial parasite we meet in-game. He and the protagonist form a symbiote bond. The protagonist would never have been able to make it to Polis without his violent companion, for it is the latter who provides the weaponry and the extra hands to hold all the necessary tools. This is one of my favourite details in this game, that when looking down you have a fully modelled body, and you can even see the effects of the parasite's attachment. I find it fascinating that the parasite helps you in this way, that you are essentially acting as two halves of a single whole, and this is because you are essentially one being throughout your journey. Confirmation of this comes near the end of the game, when we try to cut off the parasite's growths from our hands. When we do this, we constantly take damage, because damaging the parasite is damaging yourself. As is fitting for your shadow, your parasite has opposite goals to yourself. You wish to ascend to a new state of consciousness, whereas it wants to absorb you and ascend to a new state of physicality. Flesh versus the consciousness represented by the parasite and the protagonist, respectively. Humanity wants to escape their flesh bodies, and yet the parasite is here as the avatar of flesh, to remind us that we cannot escape our biological element. At the end of the game, the poor protagonist is consumed by the parasite, right on the cusp of his own ascension. We then witness the horrific transformation as the amalgam takes a new shape, which to me looks like a cocoon. A cocoon for what? Something new and terrifying, I have no doubt. Additionally, I think the protagonist is not the only one in danger here. You can see how dangerously close this amalgam is to the gateway of consciousness, and some tentacle-like growths seem to be stretching out and towards it. What happens when this new being finishes its transformation? I suspect that the ascended consciousness that lies within Polis is in danger. These humans thought they had escaped flesh, yet flesh has come for them. But is there an overarching message to Scorn? Well, we have seen many of the micro-themes about humanity's destructive influence on their planet, and it illustrates our disturbing ambition as a race, and how far we could be willing to go when science and desperation reach their apex. But what stands out most to me is isolation and loss of humanity. Near the beginning of the video, I mentioned how many may assume this is an alien race. However, these humanoids are us, devoid of their original humanity and individuality. A future where we ourselves are mass-produced and recycled, to the point where we don't even value our own flesh anymore. Combined with the ideas of ascended consciousness and leaving our bodies behind, and it is hard to see this race as even human anymore. These are all questions we ponder alone, as we walk through the bones of a failed civilization. Never in my darkest dreams did I conceive of such a harrowing future, where humanity turned their own flesh into a farmable resource. A future where the true human race died long ago. So thanks guys, that is my take on Scorn and its various themes. A game that has fascinated me for a long time, and so I was really happy I was finally able to tackle it on the channel. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you played this game? If so, what was your assessment of the story? Remember, if you liked this content, then please consider giving the video a like and subscribing for more, as this helps me out immensely. But until next time folks, I will see you on the assembly floor. Take care and have a wonderful evening.